What's up, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Facts on the Ground. I am joined, as always, by my co host, Misty Winston. And today we are extremely pleased to have as our guest Jeffrey Haas, who is a lawyer who formerly defended Black Panther member Fred Hampton. He's an activist. He's the author of the book, The Assassination of Fred Hampton, and he's also the co founder of the People's Law Center. And today we're going to talk with him a bit about some new documents that were released under under a FOIA request, which pretty much sealed the deal. I would say that Hoover and the FBI were directly involved with Fred Hampton's assassination, but we'll get into that more with Jeffrey. So, Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time. Before we get into the new developments, we kind of wanted to, just for our viewers, kind of go back and look at a little bit of the history. I'm kind of interested, I know you discussed a little bit in your book, but how did you find yourself in Chicago? I know you were born and raised in the South. How did you find yourself in Chicago doing the kind of work that you were doing with the Black Panther Party?
Well, I went to law school in Chicago from 64 to 67. And it was a very turbulent time in this country. And I guess it was a big time of change for me. With the civil rights movement going on nationally, also in Chicago, Dr. King came to Chicago at that time to attempt to integrate and was met by tremendous, he said he'd never seen racism like he saw in Chicago. So that was going on, and the university was expanding into the Black neighborhoods. So that was an issue. Of course, the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement was at a peak. And so I became more and more conscious of that and what was going on. And even at the time, the law school was fairly liberal, and one of my classmates was Bernadine Doran. And so she actually had me take a job with civil rights
from the Weather
law
Underground
in Atlanta one summer. And so I think all of those things organized me a lot. And then I didn't know what I wanted to do when I graduated, but I took a job at Legal Aid. And so I was assigned to various offices in the Black community. And they were trying to build low-income housing under the new Housing Act. And I really saw how difficult it was for Black community groups to work in Chicago if they didn't have the support of the Daily Machine. And so we would put in proposals and they would always get turned down. So I saw that frustration coming from a lot of areas, and that the solution seemed to be to organize. And actually, Fred Hampton came to somebody I knew and a group of other lawyers at Legal Aid and said, we need a law office to defend the people. The Panthers are getting arrested, the Young Lords are, the anti-war movement. And so we need somebody to defend us. At Legal Aid, we couldn't do criminal defense. So all those things led us, me somewhat hesitatingly, to start the People's Law Office with 5 other people in a former sausage shop in Chicago's Lincoln Park in the summer of 1969.
And so, when did you first get in touch or come in contact with Fred Hampton or the Black Panther Party in general?
Well, as I said, Fred had talked to my eventual, then one of the other founders, Dennis Cunningham. Dennis had defended Fred when he was accused of leading a demonstration in Maywood to demand a athletic center for Black people. There was no swimming pool where Black kids could go in the summer. White kids could go to a private pool in a nearby suburb. So Fred Fred had organized the rally, took them to the Maywood City Council, and they weren't let in and they were tear gassed. So while Fred was negotiating for a larger room, some of the other young people ran away and broke some windows. So they ended up charging Fred and the other organizer with mob action, even though they were never anywhere near even the property damage that was done. So my eventual partner, Dennis, and Jim Montgomery defended Fred Hampton. And I actually met Dennis the day King was killed. There were riots in Chicago, and they were arresting everybody on the street, and we watched it. And so I came from my house, and he came from where he was, and we were the two people who showed up to defend the young people getting arrested on the streets that night in bond court. So that's where I met Dennis.
Yeah, that's what kind of I know you said that you were working on some of the housing stuff that they were trying to accomplish, and then also defending them in criminal courts. What other kinds of work were you doing with the Black Panther Party during that time?
Well, like I said, I helped them because they had been attacked so many times by the police and the FBI and shootouts, and they had set the office on fire. The police had urinated on the breakfast cereal that they'd gathered for the breakfast program. They wanted to buy their office because they were getting evicted. So having done a little bit of landlord-tenant law at legal aid, I was picked to go and help them get the contract signed to get the property. So that took me directly to the Panther offices just 2 days before Fred was killed on December 2nd. Our office also was involved. Fred was framed up for the theft of ice cream from an ice cream truck across the street from his house. And the vendor was held down while 71 ice cream bars were passed out to neighborhood kids. And so Fred and other people came to the scene because it was right where he lived. And so the police came and they had the vendor identify Fred as the person who did it. In any case, it was a low-level property crime. Fred had another lawyer, and he gets convicted, and the judge says, well, I'm going to give him probation. But then we had a very ambitious prosecutor named Ed Hanrahan who had declared a war on gangs and said the Panthers were a gang. So he, at that time, still somewhat true, but the political machine leaned on the judge, and he gave Fred Hampton 2 to 5 years in a penitentiary. And Fred went down to Southern Illinois. Our office then got involved in getting Fred out on an appeal bond, going around to people in Maywood who knew Fred, the mayor. We actually got affidavits from the mayor and city council people and the principal of the school about how actually Fred had helped them deal with racial issues in the community. He was a leader and he shouldn't be in jail. And we actually got him out on an appeal bond in the summer of '69. So we had done work with him there. And then I went to the speech he gave when he got out of prison in August of '69, a speech which has been videoed, which is famous and which had a tremendous impact on me.
You actually speak about that in your book. I was wondering if I was actually going to ask you about that because watching that speech personally myself, it had an impact on me. I can't imagine having been in the room. But you speak about it in your book about how when he said, he was doing the back and forth with the crowd, I am a revolutionary, that at first you didn't feel quite right saying the word, I am a revolutionary. Can you kind of speak about that and how it was to be in that room?
Yes. Well, Fred had been in prison and everybody knew he had been framed up. And when he came back, he'd been gone about 4 or 5 months, and he went down to Menard and he came back. And so there was a big celebration for him at a church on the west side of Chicago. And my eventual law partner, Flint, and I, we had started People's Law Office at that time. We went to hear Fred speak. And it was amazing. It was a celebration. And he came out. He wasn't dressed in a leather jacket, actually. He was very smooth skinned and in a turtleneck sweater. And he addressed the crowd. And he, of course, began with this: I've been down to the Menard. I've been down to the prison. I've heard the beat of the people. And he gave the other speech about white power to white people and black power to black people and brown power to brown people and X power to those I left out, which people forget also Fred had a good sense of humor. But then he got to the point after talking about that, and he also had said in that speech, some of you are afraid to make a commitment at the age of 20 because you say, I'm too young to die. But Fred said, if you're not willing to make a commitment at the age of 20, then you're dead already. And so he naturally inspired and excited people. And then I was watching considering myself a lawyer for the movement, necessarily of the movement. And so Fred said, okay, everybody stand up. And he said, now raise your right hand. And we did. And he said, I am. Repeat after me, I am. And people did. And then I did. And he said, a revolutionary. And so then Fred, I couldn't say it. I wasn't prepared to say it. And then he had us repeat it again. And by the third or fourth time, I think I was shouting, I am a revolutionary, just like everybody else. And I felt like it was a threshold that Fred took me across like everybody else. And of course, in that speech at the end of it in the August of '69, he said, I'm not going to die slipping on a piece of ice. I'm not going to die of a heart attack. I'm going to die fighting for the things I believe in. I'm going to die fighting for the international proletarian revolution. And why don't you die in the revolution or live in the revolution? So it was, fortunately, it was captured on film by the film group. My wife at that time was working for the film group, so I knew a little bit about Fred from that. But yeah, it was a very dramatic moment, and it certainly has affected me, and also the fact that he was dead, and I went to visit one of the survivors the same morning he was killed.
So
Yeah, that was an intense speech for sure.
just to backtrack a tiny bit, would you say, Jeffrey, that Fred was essentially a target from the moment he came on the scene, so to speak?
Yeah, in probably at higher and higher levels. Locally, he was a target when he led that demonstration and they picked him out to arrest him. He was a target when he got the charge for taking the ice cream. He also said, when he came to us, he said, every time I step out on the street, they're arresting me. I can't even drive anymore because I get a ticket. They get pulled over every time. So we know from his own accounts that he was getting harassed. And we also know now from FBI documents that he'd been put on an agitator index and focused on. So I think, and as he developed and began to get a national reputation and actually was being considered for a national position in the Panthers and went out to Oakland to discuss that, I think he became more and more a target, not just of the local police and local Red Squad, but of the FBI.
Yeah, and I think that people, I don't think it will surprise anyone that he was such a target. He was extremely gifted as a leader, very charismatic, a phenomenal speaker. I think that's something that will shock no one that he was so targeted. I think that he also, I mean, you said, just previously that, I'm not going to die of a heart attack. I'm going to die fighting, for the people. I think he knew, he always knew that he was going to be a target. Would you say that that's accurate, that he kind of knew what was coming?
Well, there is something very haunting listening to that speech, also hearing the speech that Dr. King gave the day before he was assassinated. May not get there with you. So I think in some way, yes, he understood that. And, he had said at one point, he said he wanted to be a lawyer. That was one of he said, but I don't have time. It's like things are moving too rapidly. And actually later it went on, there was an intensity about what Fred did, like he was living on borrowed time. Eventually his conviction was upheld. He was going to have to go back to jail. Was he going to go underground? What was he going to do? So that issue was also, but he definitely felt targeted.
So you had some one-on-one time, or at least face-to-face conversations with Fred when he was alive. Is that correct?
I did. Well, the one that stands out to me is the one that I mentioned when I go to the office of the Panthers on December 2nd. And there we're supposed to, he had raised the money and we were going to give the money to the seller, and he had to sign a contract, which I was going to bring back in a couple of days. And I went to the Panther office to do that. And I just remember sort of being let in and who are you? And then waiting. And then he came out and there was this really dynamic young man. and he was just like repeating orders to people, but getting back feedback. Like, you got to show up at the breakfast program on time. You got to sell your quota of newspapers, and things like that. But it wasn't just he was saying you got to do it. He showed up at 6 o'clock in the morning. He sold his quota of newspapers. He didn't ask other people to do what he wasn't willing to do.
Mhm.
So I think people talk a lot, justifiably, about what a good speaker he was, but the fact he had so much credibility because he did what he was asking and urging and inspiring other people to do also.
And I think I remember seeing an interview with you at one point where you said that everything that he did, there was love in it, there was purpose in it, and he was that kind of a leader where you could tell that he, truly believed in everything that he was doing, and he had a real love for the people. And I think that sometimes gets lost too when we're talking about him as a person. It's easy to talk about, like you said, what a great speaker he is or what a dynamic leader he was, but he really did have love for the people. Would you say that you witnessed that too?
Absolutely. There was a magnetism about Fred. There was a warmth about Fred. There was even a playfulness about Fred. I guess I hadn't even thought about that word, but, and a humor about Fred too. It's really quite amazing. And so I think people revered him, and yet at some hand they love being with him at the same time.
Mhm.
When you say the humor, that makes me think of I watched the video of the mock trial that they did
Yes.
and about the ice cream bars, and he said something about, I know I'm big, but I'm not big enough to eat 71 ice cream bars. And he had like a humor that often gets looked over because of, how dynamic he was and how, kind of a forceful leader he was. He was really funny, actually. That
Yeah,
just made me think of that watching that.
extremely intelligent. Um,
And
so
but
I
one of the other things I learned, and I'm not saying he was a saint, but in the process of writing the book, we interviewed quite a lot of people, and particularly Panther women who had been in the party. And Fred actually consciously promoted many of these women to positions of leadership in the city and state, head of the medical clinic, leading role in the breakfast programs. And he actually urged them to be speakers for the Panthers. And this wasn't a public position at that time so much, but it did strike me that all of these women felt like they were being asked to take on responsibility and leadership, not just be people who worked in the back office or made the breakfast. So it was I think it was a quality that he had. In high school, he had led a demonstration because Black girls weren't allowed to be considered for homecoming queens,
Mhm.
which a lot of people said, well, so what? But then he also led a demonstration for Black teachers and administrators. So there was something about Fred that he couldn't, as Dad said, Fred just couldn't accept injustice anywhere. And I think that
Yes.
carried over to how he connected with people.
And when you talk about the women, I actually remember, I'm not going to remember who the quote is from, but there's a woman that's quoted in your book that you asked, how were the women treated in the Black Panthers? And she said, well, some of the men would hit on us and things like that, but Fred never did. Fred always treated us with respect. He always knew that we were a crucial part of the work. And I think that, for that time, that really speaks a lot about him and how he saw women in the movement. So, I mean, yeah, I would absolutely agree that that's to his credit for sure.
And some of the earliest organizers of the Panther chapter were women. They started meeting in a home of Ann Campbell, who was one of the Panther women who joined and was very active in the party. And actually, when Fred said, you got to start a law office, Ann came and worked with us sort of as a Panther donation or participation, and worked in our office. So yeah, it was very revealing to learn this history.
So Jeffrey, I absolutely we want to talk to you about the new documents that have come out, and also before that, sort of to set up the a context for the documents, the Fred's assassination. Um, but one thing I wanted to ask you about was how important it was to Fred for the Black communities to have education almost as the foundation, and then everything else came from there. Because there's a great video clip of him out there talking to, I believe, not Black Panthers, but another possibly allied movement.
Yeah.
And he's going through the points and he basically says, well, these are great, but there's nothing in here about education. So how are you going to do this without education? So I'm wondering if you can speak to that and shed a little more light on that.
Yeah, well, of course, it's a great video clip in which he's talking to somebody from another organization who's telling him how many programs there are. And Fred asks, well, what's your education program? And he says, well, we haven't formulated that yet, or something to that extent. And Fred said, well, then it doesn't mean anything, or it's not really, that's what should come first. And so he used to say about the breakfast program, he said, some of these welfare mothers don't believe in socialism, but they sure love the breakfast program. So part of the breakfast program was talking to the parents, talking to the adults who brought the kids there about who the Panthers were. Why was it that kids were going hungry in Chicago before they went to school? Why didn't the city provide those basic necessities? And that was part of the Panther program. It wasn't limited, of course, just to breakfast. It was health care. It was decent housing and decent education and freedom from police brutality and community control of police. So I think, their 10-point program was, basically a socialist program, but it didn't always use socialist rhetoric. Although Fred was quite well read in the many of the liberation struggles and authors of the time.
Yeah, and I think that he did it. Oh, go ahead, continue,
Oh,
please.
I just say that political education class was a must for the Panthers, that Fred led them. They were twice a week. They were required. So he never was under the illusion that people didn't have to study, that people, should feel they were understood who the history was and where they stood. And of course, this 69 was a very exciting time internationally. There were revolutions going on everywhere and successful revolutions. So there was a lot to be learned and excited about by understanding the international situation. And of course, the Panthers were anti-imperialists. They were totally opposed to the war in Vietnam. They were opposed to black. It's one of their programs was one of their demands of 10-point programs that black people not be drafted and not serve in foreign wars of the U.S.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's something that I known for a long time, that the Black Panthers were, or you could say have been, because they they do still exist to some extent, I suppose you could say, but that they've been anti-imperialist. But something I've learned recently is how, I guess you could put it, pan-radicalist they were, as far as working across different radical groups, not just groups that specifically aligned with, say their 10-point platform or something else that they were calling for. Like they were willing to reach out to other potential allies who were fighting against, you know, imperialism, against police brutality. And I'm wondering if you can just speak about that a bit, because I think that gets lost in the narrative, that people think of the Black Panthers as this solely Black culture oriented revolutionary movement. And it was so much more than that.
Uh, well, yeah, for one, and just in terms of their relationships with white people, no, white people were not, they did not try to bring white people into the Black Panther Party. On the other hand, you didn't feel like because you were white, therefore they wouldn't talk to you or you couldn't work together on things. And so they said, even to Fred Hampton, well, how come you have white lawyers? And he said, well, Charles Gary has represented Huey Newton pretty successfully out on the West Coast. And so the lawyers who can help me are the ones I need, not necessarily black or white or, and that went to also he organized the doctors who came to the medical clinic. So in terms of his personal relationships, you didn't feel that there was this nationalism and this separation that some other groups had. And of course, he also was instrumental in organizing the Rainbow Coalition, where he
Mhm.
went out and met with leaders of the Young Lords organization, which had been a street gang in Chicago of Puerto Ricans that had fought gentrification in Lincoln Park and formed a coalition with them. And similarly with Appalachian whites up in Uptown. And they all suffered from police brutality and bad housing and bad schools, and they had a lot in common also. And so they were able to successfully form this coalition to demand, socialist changes or radical changes from the government.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is, "If you have revolution on your mind, we can work together." And I think that that really spoke to how he saw the revolution. It's you need numbers for that. And so if you have common cause, you have to be willing to work with people, across class, which I think was really the most important thing to him, was, the class aspect of it. But there's the morning of, when you found out that Fred had been murdered. The story that you tell it is really pretty intriguing. You had been up all night working on something else entirely. Can you speak to that, like how that whole day panned out for you?
Yes, like I said, I'd been to the Panther office on December 2nd, which was a Tuesday, and I think we had arranged that I would probably come back on Thursday with the documents for him to sign. Wednesday, I ended up staying up late, working on a proposal for low and middle income housing that members of the coalition had done, the Rainbow Coalition. And I got home at 4 in the morning, and about 6:30 in the morning, there was a knock on my back door, and my law partner, Skip Andrew, was standing there already in a coat and tie. And I looked at him, and he said, the chairman's dead. The pigs vamped on his crib this morning, and he was killed. And I was stunned, like this guy who made us feel alive, who feel almost invincible. I was being told he was dead, and I couldn't believe it. And what he knew or communicated at that time was the police had done a raid on the home where Fred and Deborah Johnson, his fiance, were that morning, and that Fred was killed. Some people were shot and were at the hospital, and some people were at the local jail. I don't remember if he knew that Mark Clark was also killed. So he went to with Bobby Rush to identify the body and also to the apartment that they had not sealed. And I went to the Wood Street Police Station where Deborah Johnson was still there in her nightgown, and two other of the survivors, Harold Bell and Louis Trulock. And I asked to see Deborah Johnson and showed them my log card. And they said an instruction from Edward Hanrahan that nobody was to see these survivors. And I knew somebody at the state's attorney's office, and I read them a statute that said it was a felony to interfere with an attorney visit. And so this person talked to Hanrahan, so I got the opportunity to see them. And the first person I saw was Deborah Johnson, and she came out in her nightgown, 8 months pregnant. And she told me she had been in the bed with Fred Hampton, that there was a knock on the door, and the police came in firing. And the firing continued, and during a lapse in the firing, they had actually pulled her out of the bedroom, and she saw two police go back in. She said two pigs go back in, and one of them said, is he still alive? And then she heard two shots, and the other one said, he's good and dead now.
Hmm.
And she said, that's what she told me, crying and sobbing. And I felt like pretty helpless, like, what can I do? I can't bring Fred back to life. And that's how my morning started, her version. Meanwhile, Skip and Flint was a law student. They go to identify the body, and then they go to the apartment, and they begin. And the police had not sealed it, and they went in and then began to pick up the shells and the cartridges, and to trace the directions of the bullet holes. See the bloody poster in the hall. They had actually dragged Fred's body out after he'd been shot, sort of like a trophy. Hmm. And they took, Skip had the forethought to bring along a video or a movie maker and a minister, so that all this was, there was a record of how the apartment looked when they came in, and each piece of evidence. So even though Hanrahan that day was, and the raiders were saying it had been a shootout, that they had came to search a warrant, and the police and the Panthers had opened fire, and there but the grace of God, all of my people would have been killed, Hanrahan said. That was a different story than what the physical evidence showed and what we learned from the survivors. And the physical evidence showed, as the survivors recounted, 90 bullets from the police direction of the police toward the Panther. The only outgoing bullet was from the weapon of Mark Clark, a shotgun, and it went into the ceiling of the hallway. And we think it was after he was shot, and it was a reflex because it was straight up into the air. It wouldn't have, it wasn't directed at any person or any person's height.
Right.
So Hanrahan continued. I think he thought his political career, and he was the heir apparent to Daley, would be advanced. However, the police story began to come undone, and he tried to get the Tribune to carry his version. And he gave them a photograph of the back door with 2 black dots and said, "These are the shots. This is proof that Hampton fired his .45 from the bed where he was lying." And we brought the press there, and those two black dots were actually nail heads. And so the police story began to come undone. Even though they charged the Panthers, all of the survivors were charged with attempted murder. And Doc Satchel had 4 .45 caliber machine gun bullets in him and had barely survived and lost a large part of his colon, and 3 other people were shot. Of course, Mark Clark was killed. It took several months, and then suddenly one day Hanrahan dropped the charges, and we found out later it was because the crime lab had lied and said that 2 shotgun shells that the police said came from Brenda Harris's gun from the front couch actually came from police weapons. So they had no evidence that any of the survivors ever fired.
Right. And if you look at the footage from the scene, I suppose it's the forensic examiners who are looking at the scene, but they have the bullet holes sort of mapped out the way they do. And you can see, I don't know if it's all 90, but it's pretty close. And it's ridiculous to think that it was anything but a hit job.
It wasn't a shootout, it was a shoot in. And it's true,
Right.
when you put dowels in the walls, and you can tell an entry hole is smaller, and the wood on the exit hole, the wood is frayed outward. So you can trace the direction the bullet came from. And when we put the dowels in, all but one came from the direction of the police as they entered the front and back door. The Panthers were in the other side of the apartment, and the only other one was from Mark Clark. Police had also said the police claimed that there was only one bullet hole in the front door, and that was from Mark Clark's weapon. In fact, we found that what could have been the first shot was actually a shot coming in right in the middle of the front door from one of the police at the front.
And what quick thinking by Skip Andrew to have the presence of mind to have a video camera to follow along. And I mean, if anybody's interested, that footage is included in the documentary, The Murder of Fred Hampton. You can see them walking through. You can see when you just spoke about the poster, you can see when he holds it up and says, "This must be where the chairman died." It's very, I will warn people, obviously it's very graphic, but it is very telling. You can really see the devastation that they caused in that apartment. It's pretty horrendous, but kudos to him for having the presence of mind to bring along a video camera. It's very strange to me that the police didn't, think to kind of, make sure that people stayed out. They even did tours with journalists, did they not, through the apartment?
Absolutely. It's been a little bit of a mystery why the police didn't seal off, obviously, a crime scene of 2 people were dead, 4 people were shot. I think there are 2 explanations. One is They did this at 4:30 in the morning in the middle of the Black community. They didn't want to stick around and wait for the community response. But another one was Hanrahan called the raiders and said, "Bring the weapons you found, the Panther weapons, back to me, to my office, not to the crime lab. I want to hold a press conference." So instead of doing the crime scene and staying there and collecting the evidence, they grabbed the Panther weapons, didn't even say where they came from or whether they had been fired or do any of that. They just brought them back so that Hanrahan could hold a press conference that morning and give his version and the cops' version of what happened. So I think, but in fact, it was not, the crime scene was not protected. When this evidence began to be clear who fired the shots, the dowel show that the Panthers led walks through the apartment. And people lined up for blocks, people from the press, mostly people from the community. But, even Mike Royko, who was a cynical journalist with the Tribune, and not necessarily a friend of the movement, wrote, well, what did he say? He said, he gave the police description of it being horrendous. And he said, it certainly must have been strange because the Panthers must have been shooting it themselves.
Yeah.
Because all the bullets came toward the Panthers.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. And it had an impact because I think whereas the community and Black community was divided on the Panthers, there were a lot of supporters, there were a lot of people who weren't sure, there were people who were opposed. But the murder of a young Black leader in his bed at 4:30 in the morning, the community was outraged. And so there was a lot of pushback, and many of the Black politicians that had been loyal to Daley at that point revolted and spoke out against him and Hanrahan, who was the successor to Daley. And Hanrahan never got reelected, even to state's attorney, and he ran for mayor and he ran for Congress. But it was the end of his political career, the way the progressive and Black community came together to expose and speak out against the raid.
They even elected a Republican, didn't they? Which was
They
kind of unheard of.
They elected Henry Hyde, who you may know, the Hyde Amendment, which prevents any government money being used for abortions. And anyway, but yes, they did. And there'd never been a Republican state's attorney in Cook County.
And I think he thought that was going to galvanize his career, and instead he essentially ended it.
He said, on my tombstone should be the tombstone I have is my career ended at 2337 West Monroe.
Well, going off of what we've just been talking about, Fred's murder by the Chicago police, I want to get into what has been newly released with regard to that, and also talk about how it wasn't just the Chicago police that was involved in this. It was, you had federal police, you had the FBI, you had the COINTELPRO going on at the time. And the documents that were recently released under a FOIA request, still redacted, but still revealing. Can you tell us about those and what light they've shed on Fred's murder?
I will. I want to give a little bit of history of what we knew and what we got and how we got it, and then how those new documents fit in.
Please.
So after the charges were dropped, people said, well, it's not enough that the survivors don't have to go to prison. We want to know what happened, who was responsible. There was a cover up, it seems like, by the crime lab and the investigative agency. So with help from some of the stalwarts in the Lawyers Guild, Arthur Canoy came and he said, we've been fighting civil rights in the South and you got to figure out a way to bring this to court. So we filed a civil rights suit in federal court. We had never really been in federal court. And so it was new to us, but we had a lot of support from the Guild. We got support from the NAACP. Anyway, we sued Hanrahan, the Raiders, the crime lab, and the investigative agency and said they were all involved in a conspiracy to murder Fred Hampton. And of course, that's what we intended to try to prove. We did have all the physical evidence to support us, and the testimony of the survivors, but we drew a very hostile racist judge, somewhat along the lines of Judge Hoffman, and he hated that we were coming in accusing public officials of murder. And so he said, he dismissed our case after we litigated for a year and said, your charges are scurrilous, not the conduct we were describing, but the fact that you call them these things are scurrilous. And also Hanrahan was a prosecutor and can't be sued. So he dismissed our case. So it took us another year even to get back in court. By 1972, two things happened that changed the direction of the case. One is that it got a reveal that there was an informant high up in the Panther Party named William O'Neill. And O'Neill got arrested with a Chicago policeman actually carrying out a hit murder in Gary. And O'Neill said, well, I was just infiltrating him. But anyway, O'Neill admitted that he had been an informant since he joined the Panthers. So, and then at the same time, there'd been a burglary at a FBI office in Philadelphia, or in Reading, and they discovered documents with the title COINTELPRO. And as people studied those, they learned that there was a secret counterintelligence program that Hoover had started that was directed at the entire movement. It said one of its directives was prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the masses. And they specifically mentioned Stokely Carmichael, Elijah Muhammad, Dr. King, if he gives up his professed belief in nonviolence. So all of these were people who were named.
It was specifically a black messiah, correct?
Yes. Prevent a black messiah who could unify and electrify the black masses.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, all the people he named were black.
Right.
And so that was one of the directives. But as the things developed in the 60s, and meanwhile, the Church Committee was investigating Watergate and the hiding and the cover-up of government illegality, particularly the CIA. So we began to say, is there a connection between this COINTELPRO program and O'Neill being an informant? And was there an FBI role here? So we began to ask for discovery, and they fought us all the way. There's no connection. They said the judge ruled COINTELPRO had nothing to do with it. But then there was a prosecutor in Chicago who, in light of Watergate, didn't want to be responsible for hiding documents. So one of the documents he produced was the floor plan. It turned out O'Neill had given his control at the FBI a floor plan of the apartment 2 weeks before the raid, told him that there were weapons there. And that floor plan, it turned out, was actually given to Hanrahan's office, and the raiders carried that out. And the bullets actually went in the direction of Fred's bed. So we also discovered a document that said that action, that information was part of COINTELPRO. And we learned that also the FBI had tried to it sent a letter to Jeff Fort, the head of the Blackstone Rangers, saying, I'm just a black brother. I've been hanging out with the Panthers. They got a hit out on you. I know what I'd do if I were you. And so we gather more and more evidence that the FBI played a key role in this. And so we joined O'Neill and his control and the head of the FBI in Chicago to our case. So now we were saying that this was a conspiracy by the FBI. The judge restricted that, hid volumes, and we still would, it took us years to get this every time. And even when we had the COINTELPRO documents from the Church Committee and showed them to the judge, he still, until the start of the trial, wouldn't let them into evidence or let the jury see them. We went into an 18-month trial. It was like pulling teeth. We got 200 volumes in the second month, so we were told we could have to look through those in the morning and try the case in the afternoon. The judge protected the defendants. Both Flint and I were held in contempt, and were actually arrested in court and had to spend a night in the MCC in jumpsuits and numerous other contempts. After 18 months of trial, the judge, while the jury was deliberating, dismissed the case, saying there wasn't enough evidence to go to the jury, and then assessed costs and against the plaintiffs and against us of $100,000 and $100,000 appeal bond. So this was 1977, 7 years later, and all we had to show for it was debt. And we were pretty discouraged. And, I think if we hadn't remembered what Fred had said, if you dare to struggle, dare to win. If you don't struggle, you don't deserve to win, damn it. Peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. And so we said, okay, we can't just let this sit here. And we got the court reporter to give us the 33,000 page trial transcript on credit. And we gathered all the evidence and we read the transcript and all the documents, and we put together a 200+ page appeal. And I think partly even during the trial, we were aware we might not win. This judge isn't going to let us win in front of a jury, but we're making a record. So that even things we didn't get into evidence, we got in on the appeal. A year later, we went and the appellate court handed down an amazing decision saying that we had presented more than enough evidence to go to a jury on this conspiracy. In fact, there were two conspiracies, one to murder Fred and the other to cover it up and prevent its being known. They said that our contempts or our actions were justifiable, that we had a right to be strident and militant in defending our clients, and under the circumstances, the things we said and did were not considered contemptuous. And they also said the government's hiding of evidence could be evidence in the second trial of guilt. So the case got sent to a new judge, and we actually settled it almost 4 years later for $1.85 million for the families of Hampton and Clark and the survivors. And I guess at that point, we thought, well, the book, somewhat we knew everything that happened. But one thing that during the trial, we had attempted to go up beyond the head of the local FBI up to Hoover and to his two assistants, the head of domestic intelligence and extremism. And if we could even name John Mitchell, the attorney general, and Nixon as defendants. The judge blocked that, said you don't have evidence of that. Well, we had pretty good evidence that Hoover had signed off on a few documents and O'Neill had gotten a bonus after the raid. But
what was some of that evidence, if you can just briefly describe it?
You mean that we had at that time at the trial, or the new evidence?
Yes. Well, the evidence you had on Hoover and Mitchell.
Well, we had a lot of evidence on Mitchell because Mitchell, even though it wasn't uncovered till a year later, and we took his deposition, Mitchell was kind of proud of what role he played. So he was very forthcoming about O'Neill, that O'Neill had worked for him, that he got the floor plan. And he said, yes, I took it to Hanrahan's assistant and the leader of the raid. But both of those people denied that ever happened. So Hanrahan was saying they had their own informant, but the FBI was saying, oh no. And Mitchell even said he went to the Hanrahan's office the day after the raid and said, do you mind if we let it be known that we were the source of information for the raid? So we had that contradiction. We had the COINTELPRO. We had the bonus document to O'Neill saying, for your information that was invaluable to the role of the FBI, we're rewarding you. This was given after the raid. We had the hit document on Jeff Fort. We had the COINTELPRO objective to disrupt, destroy, and neutralize the Panthers by any means necessary. So we had that, we had the policy, we had the actions, and as the court found, we had a really strong case on the FBI's complicity in this.
And just a fun fact for our viewers, two of Ford's chief aides during the whole COINTELPRO time period were Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, which our names we're all very familiar with. So yeah, that's just an interesting little fun fact that those were two people who were heavily involved in trying to keep some of this stuff from being exposed, which is definitely interesting.
When Watergate came out, when COINTELPRO came out, actually the Congress, I think I meant at the Congress, I found this out later, voted to put restrictions on the FBI and the CIA. And it was Cheney and Rumsfeld who told Ford to veto that, which he did, and the Congress actually overruled him on that.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah,
yes,
it's just interesting how these villains of history just keep recycling their lives. It's very interesting how they keep popping up,
well, they seem to never get called
held
for.
responsible.
Same with the torture perpetuators during the Iraq War. They
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
came to justice and end up
They,
back in leadership positions under Trump.
yeah, they cycle back around again, like Gina Haspel,
Yes.
Elliot Abrams and
Elliot
We
Abrams.
tend to only hold the people who expose those things responsible and not the people who actually commit the atrocities, such as Julian Assange.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Edward
It's-
Yes.
Snowden.
Chelsea
So,
Manning. Yes.
so Jeffrey, would you say that almost immediately after Fred's murder, that you knew there was a connection between various police entities, from the Chicago PD to the FBI, or was that something that you came to realize over time? Because when I first started reading about the Black Panthers, which, believe it or not, was in 8th grade, um, even at that age, it seemed very obvious to me that, this was a Hoover operation. And I was 13, 14 at the time. So I'm just wondering if it was that obvious to you and your colleagues, but it was a matter of acquiring the evidence to bear that out.
Well, you were probably more politically advanced than I was. Bobby Rush, on December 4th, the first court date, he says, this is J. Edgar Hoover is responsible for this. He was on camera saying this. I think he said J. Hoover Edgar, but anyway, we knew who he was talking about.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was the deputy. He was the actually the chairman. Well, he was the deputy. He was the chair. I think Fred was actually he was the defense minister of the party at that time. Anyway, Rush saw it. I don't think we knew it. We were so focused on finding out what happened that day and that night that I don't think we thought that way. And even if eventually we might have, knowing something theoretically and then seeing it actually, the evidence of it, when we discovered the floor plan, like, all right, maybe the FBI was involved, but wait a minute, they actually drew a floor plan showing where Fred and Deborah would be sleeping, and they gave this to the raiders.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a level to that, even if you've surmised it or thought it, that still, is very powerful, and it's a different level of understanding.
Yeah,
To have the documentation is definitely another thing entirely than just being suspicious of it, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, to me, it's a huge indicator of premeditation and willingly and wantingly to murder this person.
Well, I think that's what the new documents show. As you mentioned, Aaron Leonard, who's been a leftist and a historian, particularly of repression on movements in the late 20th century, had put in an FOIA request for Mitchell's personnel file. And he got that on December 4th of last year, 51 years later, and it was 400 pages of files. And I think it wasn't a shock that the FBI was involved. What it did show, though, was a great deal of higher ups at the FBI focusing on Mitchell and O'Neill and the information from O'Neill. So that even before the raid, Hoover was recommending a bonus for Roy Mitchell. We knew that O'Neill had gotten a bonus. We never knew that Mitchell got a bonus. Mm-hmm. We never knew that a memo started by Moore, who was head of extremism, to Sullivan, recommending this bonus for Mitchell before the raid. That it was actually Hoover himself who personally sent a note recommending Mitchell for the bonus. This was before the raid. actually, although the document was, he actually received, the document is dated December 10th, but he signed off on it before the raid. So it shows that, and then of course, after the raid, the bonus went to O'Neill, and Johnson met with O'Neill to tell him there was a bonus coming. But we didn't know that Hoover and the top people were directly involved in scrutinizing Chicago, Mitchell, O'Neill, and the Panthers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's, and so if we'd have had this information, and we never got it in spite of years of discovery and everything else, that's kind of the first thing, this, why didn't we get this before? But to show the machinations at the top, who were involved in planning, authorizing, and then rewarding it, we didn't have. And we had made a motion to join higher ups, to join Sullivan and Moore and Hoover to the case, and possibly John Mitchell, but we didn't have these documents that showed their particular planning of the raid.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing, one other thing that came out was, throughout the rest of his career, Mitchell kept getting evaluations in which he would get more bonuses because, and rewarded for the fantastic job he did with O'Neill, how the information that they gathered led to the, quote, success of the raid, according to the FBI. And so that was something that we did not have, that his acts, which were being hid from the public, he was being rewarded for. And then one of the documents that isn't a surprise that that they were doing it, but that they put it down. There was a special state grand jury investigating the December 4th raid. One of the FBI agents was subpoenaed to testify, and they had testified, their expert, about the 90 shots to 1. But the witness was told, if you are ever asked about blank, you must immediately leave the grand jury and report to your higher ups. Do not testify about, and then it's all redacted. So clearly there was instructions to not let the grand jury ever know about the FBI role. And in fact, had that not been that burglary or O'Neill arrested, we might never have learned about the FBI role. So it really shows a collusion. There are also more redactions about information provided by O'Neill that we don't have. Why are they redacting something 51 years later? They'd also never admitted that the head of the FBI in Chicago met with O'Neill the day after the raid to congratulate him. So I think, like you said, the connection that we wanted to make or tried to make between even the Chicago FBI office and the national, we couldn't bring them in as defendants. We asked them questions and actually deposed Sullivan and Moore, but the lawyers for the U.S. attorney interjected, said that we couldn't ask, they didn't have to answer those questions.
And I think it's important to point out too, other than the monetary reward that you were able to get for the victims and their families, nobody's ever gone to jail for this. Nobody's ever gone to prison for this, for, you know, a murder. I mean, it's essentially a hit, really, a state sanctioned hit on, you know, a young Black man, 21 years old, sleeping in his bed next to his pregnant fiance. And, you know, I think that that's, like we mentioned earlier, that's why we then see these people, you know, back in power years later, because we never seem to hold them accountable. And also, I think it's important too, Bobby Rush, who you mentioned earlier, his apartment was also broken into that same night, was it not? But he wasn't home. I think I remember watching an interview with him. Yes.
When I went to the Wood Street station that morning, I interviewed not only Deborah Johnson, but Louis Trulock and Harold Bell. And Trulock came out. He had met Fred in prison. And so he also had tried to wake up Fred that morning. He didn't wake up. And there's evidence that he was drugged before the raid, because with all these bullets, and he didn't have any serious bullet wounds until they walked into his room. But Trulock said, while they were holding us in the back, I heard them say, Rush is next. And he told me this. I got in touch with Bobby Rush, and that's the reason Bobby Rush wasn't at home that next night. The police did raid his apartment. they claim they found some marijuana and maybe a gun, which of course wouldn't have been there because they knew the raid was coming. But, and then he became a fugitive and he was afraid of being killed. And we arranged for him to be turned in on Jesse Jackson's push program on a Saturday when the whole world was watching and seeing that they couldn't claim that he tripped and fell down the stairs while they were arresting him.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say that there was evidence that Fred Hampton was drugged, isn't it true that the informant was actually at the apartment that night and then left prior to the raid? I'm assuming that we are suspicious of him having been the one to have drugged Fred. Would that?
There are a lot of theories about that, and I'm trying to remember. Somebody just asked me about that. There's some evidence that he brought Deborah Johnson there that night and then left and went home. And I don't know how long he stayed. When our second autopsy was done, a private one, they found secanol in his bloodstream and enough. Fred didn't take drugs, didn't drink. So the question was, how did they get there? And they also the evidence that he never woke up. The FBI disputed that with their lab person. So the question was, and there was, some people said Fred drank Kool-Aid and O'Neill might have made the Kool-Aid that night. Some people said he didn't. We don't know what happened. The physical evidence is very strong that he was drugged. I also wonder why they would have drugged him, why they would have told an informant they were coming that night. That's a very dangerous thing. Even though O'Neill gave him the floor plan, they didn't tell O'Neill, well, we're going to raid on this particular night. I don't think they did, but so I don't know. It's still a mystery, but who did it? If there is, and was it O'Neill? Though, I guess there's still some unanswered questions.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also worth pointing out that the COINTELPRO extremely targeted the Black Panthers, but also the American Indian movement, and but just speaking to the Black Panthers, there are still many political prisoners either in prison or in exile because of this blanket persecution by the feds. Assata Shakur, for example, Sundiata Acoli, for example.
Yeah.
And once you start looking at that, it becomes clear, even if you don't have the documentary evidence, that it was a systematic, they were systematically trying to annihilate this group that for whatever reason was freaking them out. And I mean, I understand the reason.
They were a revolutionary group. They also had a very strong defend yourself politics and to some extent rhetoric. They used the term off the pig, which to them meant get police who brutalize people out of the community, but I don't know that the police took it that way necessarily. And so there certainly was a sentiment against that. And yes, they talked about the right of self-defense. They had followed police around in Oakland when they were arresting people. So that created a lot of hostility. And also the fact that they were demanding a total systemic change, and weren't working with political forces. And they also had a wide outreach, both in the Black community and with this Rainbow Coalition and other groups. All of those things Hoover saw as a threat. And it's interesting, in their COINTELPRO memos, they would write Black nationalist hate groups. And they described everything from SNCC to the NAACP. And I actually questioned one of the FBI agents and says, what's a Black nationalist hate group? And he said, it's a Black organization that has a national headquarters. So that was their definition. And so today they're targeting Black identity extremists, which is a way of obviously characterizing in a negative way a broad swath of the Black movement that believes that Black Lives Matter, whether they're part of that or any other thing. So yeah, these labels, and of course, COINTELPRO, once it was exposed, the formal program ended. But other forms of surveillance, other forms of repression have continued. And I was an attorney at Standing Rock, and we learned about tiger swine, how the law enforcement and the pipeline had actually hired a private company that started in Iraq to do counterintelligence, to do surveillance, to do infiltration. Of course, we saw this massive amount of surveillance and weaponry and drones at Ferguson and at Standing Rock, of these new weapons of sound cannons and blast grenades. What do they call the sound grenades? Concussion brigades, and concussion grenades that they shoot. So repression hasn't by any means ended, even though the formal COINTELPRO program, if anything, it's more sophisticated. Obviously, the ability to spy on people through surveillance, as Assange and other people showed was a regular thing, have increased. The use of drones, a lot of their techniques and surveillance methods are barred from Israel, who says they're battle tested on Palestinians.
Yeah.
You know, it's
ghettoized Palestinians.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's,
started shooting tear gas at Standing Rock. The Palestinians wrote to the people at Standing Rock, said, "This is what you have to do. You have to put milk and how you clear your eyes and so forth of the tear gas." So it was a real solidarity thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is nice to see, actually, because that's, I mean, as much as we are still fighting the same fights, it's still nice to see that kind of international solidarity that Fred Hampton so often spoke about.
Yes.
That's really nice to see that still exists, even though we are still dealing with many of those same battles.
Yeah, I think that's part and parcel of being an anti-imperialist, is you have to look all across the world at the struggles for self-determination that are happening.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, it's great that it's a bulwark of the Black Lives Matter platform, support for Native Americans, support for Palestinians, who they see as part of the anti-colonial struggle that they're involved in. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's, I've long been a fan of yours, not just from the book, but in watching how this whole thing, it was a decade longer than a decade, the actual court case, but how that informed your activism moving forward. And you're now very involved, like you said, in Standing Rock and in Ferguson. You're also involved in Palestinian rights, so which are all things that I also care about. So yeah, it's definitely, it's really nice to see that there is kind of that international solidarity still that exists. That's what Fred would have wanted, no matter that we're still fighting those same battles. That's how he was.
System of oppression too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. Going back to that pan radicalism that I mentioned earlier, trying to find the commonalities across our different movements, if you will, rather than the differences, and rather than insulating ourselves from one another.
Yes, indeed.
So Jeffrey, you've been very generous with your time, and we don't want to keep you any longer, but is there anything you can tell us about what may be coming up with regard to any more documents being released, anything more being revealed about what happened to Fred?
Well, we're going to actually, Flint and I have a call arranged with Aaron to see how we might follow up with the FOIA request. Also, Bobby Rush has told people that he wants to take it to the Biden administration and say, release the entire FBI file on Fred Hampton. Why 51 years later, what could there be that could be, imagine a lot of things could make the FBI look bad and probably higher ups, but why is that in the national interest to keep that hidden? So I'm hoping that happens. And I'm also involved possibly in a podcast that will also be sort of a documentary, at least audio, and possibly a movie about a sort of a documentary on Fred Hampton. And there's, of course, a feature film that's coming out next week, which we were not part of making,
Mhm.
uh, called Judas and the Black Messiah. I haven't seen it, so we'll see what. I think that'll, at a minimum, will increase a lot of interest in who Fred Hampton was, what happened to him, and how did it get uncovered.
Yeah,
Yes.
and just knowing Fred as you did, do you think he would want to be called a messiah?
No, I think that's what the FBI called him, and I think it's appropriate that we show that they called him a Black Messiah.
I see.
I don't know that that's the title that he would. No, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, I
Okay.
didn't know him, but I think he would reject that wholly.
Yeah, I believe so too. I just saw the title of that film for the first time today, and it struck me
I
as
think it premiered at Sundance on Sunday, or it premieres
Sunday,
this Sunday. This
yesterday,
Sunday?
actually,
Yeah.
it was.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I'm very excited to see that actually, and I'm really hopeful that you'll be involved in a potential podcast or documentary because, I would love to see something like that happen. And hopefully we can. I mean, if we can put some public pressure on the Biden administration to potentially get all of all of the documentation declassified, that would be amazing. That would be excellent. I think it's, for the historical value alone, I think is necessary, and I think it would also do maybe a lot in some healing aspects of that whole time period, and
Yeah,
could
just
inform us moving forward.
I think so, and I would like to see, but I'm not even in Chicago. I think it'd be up to people there and people on the ground and people in the community. But I'd like to see a formal apology, and just like was done in the John Birch torture cases, a monument, and the fact that it be taught in schools what the FBI and the police and politically ambitious Chicagoans did to a young Black leader. So I do think the
Yes.
things that could and should be done that make the case situation in Fred's life and death very relevant today.
Yes. And I know that at one point there was a movement too to get 2337 West Monroe as like a historical landmark or something. Did they ever were they ever successful at doing that? Do you know?
No. Well, I can't remember if I know Maywood gave a memorial and has their athletic center named after Fred Hampton, but that was not successful at the city council.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up, I just also do want to give a quick shout out to Phil Geronimo over at Opposite Books. Was very kind to me. He actually saw me tweeting about Fred Hampton and got in contact with me to see if I would be interested in speaking with you. And I'm eternally grateful to him. We're also going to link to his bookstore's website in the show notes. Everybody should be supporting independent bookstores. And obviously, I'm a little partial to this one because of what Phil did for me and getting us in contact with you. So huge thanks to Phil.
thank you, Phil.
And yes, thank you, Phil. And
Phil did have me come and speak at the bookstore and was very supportive. So
yes,
also,
yeah, that was very nice of him to reach out to me and to make this happen for us. So I'm very grateful to him for that. And Jeffrey, to you, thank you. Seriously, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, for all of your work throughout all of the years. Like I said, like I told you on the phone, I've been a big fan of yours for a long time. So this was kind of a thrilling moment for me. So I appreciate you very much taking the time to speak to us.
thank you all for what you're doing.
Yes,
When
thank you
I
Thank
so
you.
started
much.
talking about Fred, and it's kind of hard to stop. So I'm glad
Yeah,
we had an
I know.
extensive interview in many places. So,
I could
Yeah.
talk to you for hours, but I don't want to take too much of your time. But I do appreciate you being so generous and being willing to speak with us. It really means the world to me personally. So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
So everybody who's watching, our guest today has been Jeffrey Haas. He is an attorney who formerly defended Black Panther member Fred Hampton. He is the author of The Assassination of Fred Hampton. He's also the co-founder of the People's Law Office. I got that wrong the first time around. I said the People's Law Center. It's the People's Law Office. and he is continuing to do lots of good work with regard to civil rights movements like the Black Panthers, more so independent civil rights movements than sort of government trotted out ones that don't amount to much of anything. He's done a lot of valuable work over many decades, and we really appreciate him spending the time with us. So, Jeffrey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you're welcome back anytime.
Anytime.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Take care.